Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Here we review stories that beautiful people like yourselves post on the internet. Today's story's title goes like this. Parents neglected me for my whole life and spent the college fund on my sister's wedding that my grandfather left for me and said, quote, "We wish we never had you," end quote. All of a sudden, they started acting very kind towards me and I didn't understand why. Until I received a call from a lawyer, and oh boy. So I, 20 female, moved out of my house about 2 years ago, after I found out that my parents had spent the entire college fund which had been left to me by my paternal grandfather on my sister's wedding. My sister Kylie, 22 female, got married 4 years ago. She had a pretty fancy wedding, but I really believe that it was either her or her husband paying for it, or maybe her in-laws were going to foot the bill. Because my parents were both middle management at best and couldn't afford the kind of wedding that my sister had on their own. But then about a couple of months ago, before I was supposed to start college, I asked my parents if they were going to pay for my tuition, and they said no because they'd already spent my grandfather's money on my sister's wedding, so they didn't have anything left for me, and I would have to look out for myself. I was obviously furious and wanted to sue them, but unfortunately, my grandfather hadn't left any documents which I could use to prove that the money that they'd spent for their personal use was intended to be used as my college fund. I thought about asking my grandmother about this, but I didn't, because she was extremely sick at the time and was in and out of the hospital almost daily. I couldn't, with a good conscience, bother her about this when she already had so much on her plate. I would visit her pretty often and try to take care of her to the best of my abilities, but all she wanted for me was to go to college and make a good future for myself. She believed that my father had put the money that my grandfather left for me to good use, and I was going to use that money for my tuition. My grandparents didn't know what kind of person my father was and how I was treated at home, and I don't really blame them for it, because it was partly my fault for never telling anybody. To be honest, I was always neglected at home and my sister was the favorite. I spent almost 18 years of my life trying to win over my parents, but with no luck. It was almost as if they'd made up their mind to make sure that I felt as unloved and unwanted as they could make me feel. They would never attend any of my events, and I rarely ever even got a smile or congratulations from them whenever I would achieve something. I didn't tell anybody because it was embarrassing for me to even think that my parents didn't like me. The last straw for me was when I asked them about my college fund, because my grandmother had always told me that my grandfather had put aside money for both my sister and me. At least he didn't play favorites. When I asked my parents about it, they told me that they had spent it all on Kylie's wedding, and I pretty much lost my cool and let them have it. It was almost 2 decades worth of anger and resentment that I let out on them, and when the floodgates broke, there was just no repairing anything. I didn't mince my words, and neither did they, because I still remember them telling me that they wished they never had me. Once they said that, they couldn't really take it back, and I partly think that they would want to take something like that back either. They meant every word of what they said. I packed my bags that very day and decided to leave that house forever. I slept on a couple of friends' couches for a few weeks afterward while trying to think of a way that I could still go to college without begging for tuition money. I couldn't even go to my grandmother because I already knew how much money she was spending on her treatment. I knew that, unlike my parents, she did care about me, and as soon as I would tell her that I needed money for my tuition, she would offer to pay for it. I didn't want her to get stressed out or fall behind on her medical expenses, even though she was pretty rich. I couldn't even apply for a student loan because, unfortunately, I needed my parents' consent for that, or at least a guardian's. As a last resort, I decided to ask my friends to help me out with the money, and I promised that I would return it to them as soon as I was able to. It was embarrassing and humiliating to ask, but luckily my friends from high school were pretty much the best people alive. There was a group of about 7 to 8 friends of mine who spoke to their parents, and all of them pulled the sum of their money to help me out. Their parents were reasonably well off, so they could afford to help me, and I was, and still am, extremely thankful to all my friends and their parents for helping me out. That's how I was able to pay for my tuition, and alongside that, I obviously also worked and used all my money for tuition. I graduated a couple of months ago and have been living with a friend from college ever since. And recently, my parents tried to get back in touch with me. It was pretty strange because I had them blocked, so they had to make the extra effort to get a new phone number to contact me. They were extremely nice to me on the phone and told me that they wanted to apologize to me and build a better relationship because they really regretted the way that they behaved with me in the past. These were words that I thought that I would never hear from my parents, so I was naturally very shocked. This happened about 4 days ago, and they asked me if I would be willing to meet them today. I was very dazed, so I ended up saying yes. I didn't really know what to expect, so I even called my sister to ask about it, but she told me that she didn't know either and hung up, which wasn't surprising because it's not like we were friends. I called my mother about it too because I had told her the truth recently. Since she was doing better health-wise now, she told me that she didn't have any idea either. It wasn't until yesterday that I got to know the real reason. Last evening around 7, I received a call from a lawyer saying that my grandmother had recently changed her will and she wanted me to know that she was going to leave everything to me. It was a considerable amount of money and all her property and assets, which were worth quite a lot. I was shocked and didn't know what to say, so I asked the lawyer if this was supposed to be a prank or something, but he told me that this was all true. And if I had any follow-up questions, I could talk to my grandma about it, because his job was to be the messenger. So, after that phone call, I immediately called my grandmother up to ask what this was all about. And she told me that she'd been planning this surprise for me for almost a week now. Last month, after I told her about the truth of my relationship with my parents, she finally saw my dad for what he truly was and confronted them the very next day. She expected them to at least be sorry about what they'd done, but they didn't seem apologetic in the slightest, and in fact, even said that they had no regrets, because at least now, I wasn't loitering around them anymore. My grandmother was furious and told them that she was going to cut them all out of her will and was going to make sure that I got all of it. My dad had tried to argue about it, but my grandmother didn't want to hear any of it. She told me that I was probably the only person from that family who actually had a conscience, because I'd hidden something like this from her for almost 2 years. All because I was worried about her health and didn't want to stress her out too much. I even pretended to be on good terms with my family so she wouldn't suspect anything, and never did I ever even have a cross word to say about her son when she was praising him, because I didn't want her to know the truth and I was willing to go to any extent just to protect her. We got pretty emotional afterward and ended up having a heart-to-heart conversation about everything. Then, I told her how my parents had suddenly called me out of the blue to talk to me and asked me to meet them. But it finally made sense to me why they wanted me to see them. They were clearly only trying to make amends so they could fix things and hope that my grandmother would reverse the changes in her will. It had nothing to do with them finally feeling sorry about their behavior, but everything to do with their inheritance and their greed. I already hated them, and that realization just gave me even more of a reason to hate them. My grandmother told me that I could do whatever I wanted to do about the situation and she wouldn't mind, because after all, I'd been the one who had been wrong here. So, I decided that I was going to get some closure and actually go meet my parents today. Not to reconcile, but only to rub it in their face. I met them today for lunch at the most expensive restaurant that I could find nearby and told them that it would be my treat because we were finally reuniting after almost 2 years. They seemed very happy to meet me once we got there, and we even hugged and stuff. For the first couple of seconds, it felt like we were a normal family, but as soon as we were seated, I decided to cut to the chase and tell them that I knew about their little strategy to manipulate me into believing that they were finally better people now, so that I could get my grandma to change her will. My parents seemed a little put off when I said that and pretended that that wasn't the case and said that I was being too skeptical. But I could see right through their bluff and refused to back down. I told them that they could either admit it or the lunch would be over. I obviously had no intention of talking to my grandmother to change her will anyway, but I just wanted to give my parents the illusion of having a choice, just to see what choice they would make. They dropped the pretense almost immediately and told me that that's exactly what they were here for, and that they needed me to talk to my grandmother and make her see sense. They told me that they were ready to do whatever I wanted from them, but they couldn't afford to lose their inheritance, and I just absolutely had to fix this. It was quite ridiculous how desperate they were, but that's my parents for you. I told them that I would talk to my grandma only on one condition, and that is if they helped me pay back all my friends who helped me pay for college. I told them roughly the amount that I'd borrowed from my friends' parents, and my parents, after some deliberation, told me that they were ready to pay. So I told them that I would talk to my grandmother as soon as they sent me the money. They told me that they were ready to pay immediately because my dad was already carrying his checkbook, so he wrote me a check at the table itself and made me promise that I would call my grandmother and talk to her. They tried to get me to call her at the restaurant itself, but thankfully they had practically no reception, so the call didn't go through, and I told them that I would talk to her once I got home. We went to the meeting there and headed back home. But here's the catch. I have no intention of telling my grandmother anything at all. I guess people could refer to it as a scam technically, but I don't see the harm in it. They spent the money that my grandfather had left for my college fund on my sister's wedding, so I see this as nothing but retribution. I think it's completely fair, but when I told my roommate about it, she got a little weirded out and told me that it was kind of harsh. She said that if I did this, then there was practically no difference between my parents and me, so I should probably rethink what I'm going to do. I told a couple of my school friends too, but they didn't see anything wrong with it. Hypothetically, even if I did talk to my grandmother, they couldn't be sure that I'd be able to get her to change her mind, so it was a risky gamble for them anyway, and it was their choice to make that bet. My roommate is a close friend of mine, so I do take her seriously, which is why I came to Reddit for an unbiased opinion. Am I the a-hole for lying to my parents and telling my parents that I would talk to my grandmother and clear the air between them for money? Hey guys, so I decided that instead of worrying about things that I've already done, I was just going to explain my side of the story better to my roommate so she wouldn't judge me too hard for what happened. She comes from an affluent family, so she doesn't really know what it feels like to struggle with money, which is probably why she wasn't able to relate to me or understand where I was coming from. So I decided to sit her down and explain in great detail exactly how my childhood was, and how my parents always made a big deal about the money they spent on me, but never on Kylie. She knew about my history in bits and pieces, but I guess that I had never really explained these things as vividly as I did yesterday, and it finally helped her understand why I did what I did. By the time I was done telling her everything, she was almost in tears and actually hugged me. She apologized for judging me and even told me that if I were to need legal help after this, she would talk to her dad and put me in contact with his lawyer, who was one of the best in the city. I was very thankful for her and all my other friends who'd been nothing but understanding and supportive so far. It really made me feel as if I can get through practically anything, as long as we have a strong support system to fall back on. My grandmother, of course, is a major part of that support system too. I didn't want to, but I did end up telling her exactly what I'd promised my parents, and she told me that even though it was a bit dicey, it was technically completely fair. Just tit for tat. And that made me feel better about everything, because as long as my grandmother thought that I did the right thing, nothing else really mattered to me. It's been 2 days now, and I've been giving my parents daily updates on how the situation with my grandmother is. None of it is true, but I have to keep in touch with them until I'm done with the entire process of paying my friends back. I've cashed the check, but it's gonna take a few more days for it to reflect in my balance. So I'm just waiting it out right now, and unfortunately, that means I have to stay in touch with my parents. It's a nightmare, but well, you gotta do what you gotta do. So I finally paid back the last of my friends today, and as of now, I am finally free of debts. It was a weird, bittersweet feeling, but I'm glad that I'm done now. This also means that I no longer have to keep in touch with my parents and text them about things that never even happened. For instance, a conversation with my grandma where she finally decides to forgive them and include them in her will again. I blocked them today because there's nothing they can do anymore, so I don't need to be on good terms with them either. It was really relieving for me because now I feel like I can finally move on with my life. I told my grandma about it while I was visiting her today, and she told me that she was really proud of me. She also told me that from now onwards, if I ever found myself in a bit of a situation, then I was to come straight to her without worrying about how it would affect her health. She told me that there was nothing more that she wanted than to be there for her family, especially me, and I didn't need to worry about her health. She already had people for that. It was a really touching conversation, and I really wish I would talk to her back then when I was struggling with my tuition, instead of just suffering in silence like an idiot. A noble, self-sacrificial idiot, but an idiot nevertheless. So my parents are back now, and I can't say I wasn't expecting this. Of course, they would do their very best to track me down when they realized that I made a run for it with their money. They showed up at my door today, and my roommate realized that these must be my parents, so she tried to tell them to go away as soon as she opened the door, but they stood their ground and refused to even budge until they had a meeting with me. I didn't want to drag my roommate into this mess, so I told her to stay out of it and that I could deal with it myself. So she went back into her room, but not before she told them that she would call the police if they tried anything funny. After they had been warned, they took their seats on the couch and informed me very calmly that they were going to sue me if I didn't return the money, or if I didn't talk my grandmother into including them in her will within a week. They said that I had to do either of the two, or else I could expect a lawsuit very soon. I decided to pull the big guns and tell them that they could go ahead with the lawsuit if they wanted to, but then they would also have to prepare themselves to deal with the consequences of spending my college fund, left to me by my grandfather on Kylie's wedding. They tried to dismiss it as a concern because apparently I had no legal document to prove it, which was ironic because neither did they as far as I was concerned. At least I could still weaponize my grandmother's word against them if I decided to go after them legally, but they didn't have anything to use against me. They didn't even have a case, and they knew it, which is why they hadn't been able to do anything so far. And even today, they turn up empty-handed. Had there been any actual substance in their threats, then they would have already filed a case against me, instead of just trying to scare me with their empty threats. Judging by my parents' faces, they knew that I called them on their bluff and they couldn't intimidate me anymore. So they resorted to a different strategy: emotional manipulation. They started telling me all about how both of them were going to retire in just a couple of years, and they couldn't afford to keep up with this lifestyle if they didn't even have an inheritance to rely on. My mother mentioned that my grandmother had a lot, so it wouldn't really be fair for me to take all of it away from them, because it was way more than I would ever need. They wanted me to be a little less quote-unquote selfish and think of my aging parents. They admitted that what they'd done in the past was wrong, but it was just a stupid mistake, and I shouldn't hold it against them. So I reminded them that had it been a mistake, they'd had several years to correct it, but they never even tried to. They only realized that they'd made a mistake because now their inheritance was at stake. They didn't really care about me. They cared about the money, and I was well aware of that. So it was pretty stupid to try to play me for a fool. I told them that I still remember what they said to me the day I left. "We wish we never even had you." And I wish that was true as well. They didn't deserve to have kids anyway. At that point, they seemed to realize that this was a lost cause, and there was just no way to get their money back. And then it turned into complete chaos because my parents got to their feet all of a sudden and started cursing at me. I was a little taken aback because I really didn't expect them to start acting so uncivilized randomly. But then again, I shouldn't really expect a lot from my parents. My roommate luckily came out at the right time and snapped at them. She told them to get out, or else she really would call the cops, and that'll spell trouble for them. My parents left still cursing at me, but it didn't matter anymore. I was just glad that they were leaving and I didn't have to interact with them further. I wouldn't say that today was a successful day, but at least I was able to shut this chapter. Now I can finally get on without them constantly hounding me literally all the time. It's been a couple of weeks since I last spoke to my parents. It has been great for me, not so great for my parents. They decided to talk smack about my grandmother and also me to other relatives, which was a pretty bad idea because my parents were already not very well liked. They were only invited to family events and stuff because of my grandmother, but now that they're not in good terms with her, they've lost that privilege too. And they weren't doing themselves any favors by speaking badly of the woman who was the reason people even bothered with them. My grandmother thinks it's very funny how it all worked out for them. My relatives didn't know the truth about how I'd left home because of how badly my parents treated me and neglected me all along. They used to think that I left because I didn't like my parents much but never knew the details of it. Now they know, and nobody wants to talk to my parents anymore. I don't even feel bad for them, because this is exactly what they deserve. I'm living my best life and they're stuck facing the consequences of their own actions. As far as I know, Kylie also doesn't care about anybody except for her own husband and child, so my parents can't really count on her. So much for favoring one kid over the other. It finally feels as if justice has been served. Alright guys, that was it for today's story. Thank you very much for listening. Go ahead and please smash that like button and subscribe for more stories. Thanks again, and we'll be seeing you in the next one.